Hello and most welcome to H 1880. We are indeed coming closer to the magnificent 2000, and we are presently only a few away from 1900 lectures. I cannot imagine that there anybody here who can beat us. What do you think?
Let us be modest.
Yeah, and we are now finally getting into Wittgenstein.
Or rather, let us be modest and magnificent.
Yes, definitely. And Wittgenstein, I would say, is the top of the iceberg or the top of Kilimanjaro. And especially fun has been to work with the texts of Francis Y. Lynn. And yet another one is coming up now, Wittgenstein's Private Language Investigation by Francis Y. Lynn. In this article, Lynn is looking to the different takes on the private language argument. See how they lead to different consequences. There is a cornucopia of misunderstandings to be had of Wittgenstein. And they are usually never complete misunderstandings, but a matter of subtleties. But very, very important subtleties. I will begin by reading the abstract. In this paper, I first review previous interpretation of Wittgenstein's remarks on private language, revealing their inadequacies, and then present my own interpretation. Basing mainly on Wittgenstein's notes or lectures on private sensations, I established the following points. One, remembering the connection right means re-identifying sensation types. 2, the reason for no criterion of correctness is that nothing, especially no inner mechanism nor external devices, can be utilized by the private speaker to tell whether some sensations are of one type or different types. And 3, private names are not really names. Private language is not really a language. Therefore, private language is a grammatical illusion. Illusion.
Illusion.
My interpretation has the advantage of being able to reconcile Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy, which is to dissolve philosophical problems by rearranging grammatical facts with his actual philosophical practice, at least in the case of private language. Hooray! Introduction. Private language is an important topic in Wittgenstein's philosophical investigations. PI hereafter. Remarks 243 to 315 make up what is commonly known as the private language argument. The idea of a private language is this: the individual words of this language are to refer to what can be known only to the person speaking, to his immediate private sensations. So another person cannot understand the language. More specifically, the private speaker does not have any natural expression of sensation, but only has sensations. And he simply associates names with sensations. An inner world which is completely severed from the physical world. There are two major difficulties in understanding Wittgenstein's remarks on private language. One concerns the conclusion of the remarks. Does Wittgenstein say that the idea of private language is intelligible? But it is just empirically impossible to have a private language. Or does he say that the idea of private language is simply incoherent and senseless? The other difficulty arises from the apparent gap between Wittgenstein's conception of philosophy and his philosophical practice. In the early part of PI, Wittgenstein says that philosophy only describes, rearranges grammatical facts which are already lie open to view and which everybody already knows. In dealing with private language, does Wittgenstein only describe grammatical facts, or does he actually make controversial theoretical claims? If the former, why do his remarks on private language look so perplexing and not appear to be things that everyone would assent to? If the latter isn't then Wittgenstein himself an inconsistent thinker? Different answers to these questions have led to a divergent interpretations of Wittgenstein's remarks on private language. In this paper, I shall first review previous interpretations, pointing out the weaknesses. I shall then present an alternative interpretation, which will provide an answer to the questions just raised. Raise me above. Two previous interpretations.
Reviews.
There's my echo. Two most frequently discussed remarks by Wittgenstein on private language are PI 257 and 258. In 257, Wittgenstein asks how the private speaker can manage to name a private sensation. And he writes, When one says he gave a name to his sensation, one forgets that a great deal of stage setting in the language is presupposed if the mere act of naming is to make any sense. When we speak of someone having given a name to pain, what is presupposed is the existence of the grammar of the word pain. It shows the post where the new word is stationed. In the next remark, PI 258, Wittgenstein describes an imagined case. Let us imagine the following case. I want to keep a diary about the recurrence of a certain sensation. To this end, I associate it with the sign S and write this sign in a calendar for every day on which I have the sensation. The private diarist thinks that he can define the meaning of S through private ostensive definition. By concentrating his attention and impressing on himself the connection between S and the sensation. Wittgenstein then writes, but I impress it on myself can only mean this process brings it about that I remember the connection right in the future. But in the present case, I have no criterion of correctness. one would like to say, whatever is going to seem right to me is right. And that only means that here we cannot talk about right. Right there.
Fight. Right.
Commentators mainly base their interpretations either on PI 257 or on PI 258. This results in two major interpretation camps. What are those camps?
Not concentration camps.
The no stage setting interpretation camp and the no criterion of correctness interpretation camp. I shall start with a letter. Letter. Let's go to it. Two, the no criterion of correctness interpretation camp. Why does Wittgenstein say that the private diarist has no criterion of correctness? According to early commentators, the diarist cannot really re-identify his sensations due to weakness of his memory. At T1, the diarist has a sensation S, and he calls it S. Very apt. S. At T2, he has another sensation, S2. But due to the fallibility of his memory, he cannot be sure whether S2 is the same as S1. So he cannot be sure whether S2 is the same as S1. So he cannot be sure, again, whether or not this later sensation is also S.
Yes.
This interpretation has been dubbed as memory skepticism.
Memory skepticism.
A well-discussed problem with memory skepticism is that it rules out the possibility of public language too. A speaker of a public language, when applying a word to objects, may not be able to do it correctly all the time. So if memory skepticism is a correct interpretation, then both private language and public language are impossible. Another problem with memory skepticism is this. My memory is generally reliable, and this can be tested and established in various ways. Within a short period, say 5 minutes, my memory is as reliable as it can be. So why cannot I, within a short period, correctly remember a previous sensation and know that it is the same as the current one?
Karevin.
I shall call this the memory challenge. According to it, the private diarist can, within a short period, correctly re-identify his sensation and is justified in using S to record its recurrences, making private language a realizable possibility. This then contradicts memory skepticism. Hooray!
Skepticism.
Penny hoped to avoid the first problem just mentioned. That is the problem of disallowing the possibility of a public language. He makes use of the difference between knowing the meaning of a word and applying the word. Knowing the meaning of a word does not require that every application be correct. That is, remembering the connection does not always mean identifying the sensation correctly, but simply remembering which sensation the sign means. To Kenny, remembering the connection right is knowing the meaning of S. On Kenny's interpretation, the diarist cannot know the meaning of S in the future because there is no criterion of correctness for fixing the meaning. Hooray! Let us now examine how Kenny explains this. Can the diarist at the T2 remember the meaning of S correctly? One possible answer by the private diarist is by S, I mean the sensation I named S in the past, that is S1. Now the intended sensation, which is S1, is no longer present. So S1 cannot be used for making the required judgment. The diarist may appeal to a mental table in which certain symbols are connected with certain sensations. Alongside S, there is a sensation SX, and alongside T, there is a sensation SY, and so on, as Wittgenstein describes in PI 265. But surely, I can appeal from one memory to another. For example, I do not know if I have remembered the time of departure of a train right. And to check it, I call to mind how a page of timetable looked. Isn't it the same here? No, for this process has got to produce a memory which is actually correct. If the mental image of the timetable could not itself be tested for correctness, how could it confirm the correctness of the first memory? As if someone were to buy several copies of the morning paper to assure himself that what he said was true. Penny appeals to PI 265 to argue that in this case there is no criterion of correctness. The reason is that there is no independent check. So there is no way to tell whether the diarist has remembered the referent of S, which should be S1, correctly or not. The upshot of Kenny's interpretation is that it is impossible for the private diarist to know the meaning of S in the private language. There is no independent check on the diarist's use of S, and there's no correct wrong distinction in his use. Nothing, nada, niente, pare tu, tipota. So the diarist private definition is no real definition, and private language is impossible, meaning that there is no such a thing as a private language. A major problem with Kenny's interpretation is that it faces the memory challenge. If the private diarist's memory is good, then at T2, assuming that T2 is shortly after T1, he can clearly and correctly remember S1. In that case, it seems that the diarist can remember the meaning of S correctly, and hence knows the meaning of S. Consequently, it seems that his private definition can be a real definition, and that his private language can be a real possibility. Possibility. What does the echo say?
Possibility.
Let's go into Hacker. Hacker's interpretation is very close to Kenny's. He also makes use of PI 265 to argue that the diarist cannot correctly remember what S means. And therefore, there are no genuine ostensive definition, and no genuine language. Consequently, his interpretation also encounters the memory challenge, as just discussed. Candlish and Risley criticize Kenny's interpretation In their view, Kenny assumes that there was a correlation at T1 between S and S1. The problem, as Kenny conceives, is how the diarist at T2 can remember this early application. He cannot know for sure whether he did correlate S with S1. Kenny. Echo. Kenny. How that happened, I don't know. He cannot know for sure whether he did correlate S with S1. By contrast, Candlish and Risley think that at T1 there was no genuine correlation. Correlation.
Genuine.
The reason they give is that at T2, the diarist remembers nothing, zilch.
Nicht.
Nein. But the memory does at least have to be a memory. That is accurate or not, it has to be of something determinate, which existed independently of the memory of it. And the memory alone cannot bring such a thing into existence.
Oi, 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 oi. Memory. Memory.
In other words, there was no genuine correlation between S and a sensation in the first place. Candlish and Risley also appeal to PI 265 in their interpretation. According to them, the diarist merely claims that he had S1 at T1, but this has no basis independent of memory. So it is not decided that S1 really existed. Therefore, there was not really a correlation between S and a sensation. But the interpretation by Candlish and Risley is also troubled by the memory challenge. Suppose that T1 and T2 are only a short time apart, and that within this short period, the diarist's memory is reliable. At T2, the diarist still remembers clearly S1 and remembers clearly that he correlated S with S1. In this case, it seems that there was a genuine correlation between S and a sensation at T1 after all. After all.
Oh.
And at this stage, I think it's an apt to point to 1880.
And last.
Page 262.
The last two words are after all. After all.
After all.
262 in PDF 6.
was rather dense start. The PLA are we now going even deeper into. This article widens what we earlier narrowly sketched. This is the most thoroughly going into PLA and brings in different names. And what it aims to do is what I'm going to summarize today. On the top of 258, the first sentence. Thus, a private language represents an inner world which is completely severed from the physical world. Is this an odd worldview today? No. Who is the most famed philosopher to have this take on the reality? That would be René Descartes. And I would say, today we think that we are exactly this, which is described here in the first sentence. We are senseless computers registering a physicality that is outside of us. There's no re-entering and there is no exiting. There's no mouth, there is no anus, any of those things that we looked at before. We might as well be a brain in a vat. So this is, of course, the model for what used to be all of neurology, science of cognition. I'd say all subjects today in the world follow this understanding. And the important question here, still on 258, is it empirically impossible, or is it impossible in some other more profound way? This is what we are going to look further into now. First wonderful hint we have further down on that page. In the quote, when one says, is the first quote under the, yeah, that's the one. And further down, when one says he gave a name to his sensation, one forgets that a great deal of stage setting in the language is presupposed if the mere act of naming is to make sense. This is almost always forgotten. It was completely forgotten by Augustine. And we are not aware of the enormity of complexities that are before, that is needed. To know what following a rule is, FR, takes forever and ever. And we know today it is quite common that people cannot follow a rule when it comes to reading, and therefore establishes dyslexia. A habit that can almost not be unlearned or relearned. I'd say private language is a habit which needs to be little by little dissolved, eased up, so we can understand how nonsensical it is, and therefore also avoid that we fall into the trap of solipsism or reductionism. Without the private language argument, I'd say there are no other solutions than the Charybdis and Scylla of idealism and versus reductionism. Stage setting is always forgotten. A very important thing here is mentioned on page 259. And here we understand that Ling is sharper than a samurai sword. Go under the subtitle, the no criterion of correctness interpretation camp. And the paragraph that's under at the end there, this interpretation has been dubbed as memory skepticism. That little sentence has so much in store. An incredible amount of things. Private language is assumed if it's assumed that we have a world outside there. Something questioned by Julian Barber. Then memory are registrations privately of happenings in the world as we move about in XYZ. That's one aspect. The other aspect is memory skepticism. If we look into that, we will soon see that, oh my God, there is an enormity, a wild enormity of complexities, of difficulties, and how much interestingly complex everything is. And we sort of get rid of that oversimplification that leads to all the paradoxes, including the Gödelian not brain in the that, of course, reductionism, which is at majority today, and idealism that is progressing with no positions in between. Thinking more about memory and understanding, oh my God, it is not that easy. I will go all the way to 261. Five lines from the bottom at 261. I read the whole thing, but the memory does at least have to be a memory that is accurate or not. It has to be of something determinate, which existed independently of the memory of it. And the memory alone cannot bring such a thing into existence. Plato is private language. I think that is clear here now. For him, memories are somewhere hidden in our inner, and they are also images of forms, things out there. No wonder he straddle to the worst side of the two options, the Scylla and the Charybdis. He meandered down into idealism of the most fearsome kind, because he literally had no other option. There is no option here. You have to go there until somebody 1900 years later come to discover that private language does not work. That is the greatness of the scope. It will become progressively clear what we are fighting against and how that enormity will bring many boons with them. Not only dog bones, but boons with two O's. Gifts. He really gets under the skin of Plato. And memory, both in Plato and Aristotle, play a most decisive role. Dear colleague Kalle Lundahl, please enter.
Thank you. This is not working. Or yes. The word reliable. So Lean himself thinks memory can be reliable within a short period. There is no doubt of it. But I don't know if I agree with Lean. Think about phone numbers. Say somebody says a phone number to me and I have to repeat it. Rarely we get the phone number right, even if I see it in written form.
So it could be gone within a second.
Yes, absolutely. So in this, I disagree with Lean. What would you think, Hans? Is memory reliable? I say no.
Well, he just writes suppose if it were reliable.
Yes, but I think he still advances the idea. It's perhaps too early to say. Okay. He will probably make clear his own position more clearly. But I don't think that memory, even within a source or span, can be, because there can be I can hear incorrectly, or I can read incorrectly, and so forth.
Oh yeah, indeed, yeah, definitely.
So in this, and then
one could see it as a degree of reliability, that within 5 minutes it's more reliable, but not absolutely reliable.
Yes, I know, but I would even say that because it doesn't help to resolve the problem.
No, of course.
And then, of course, I agree with you. This is a horrific Platonic idea.
Yeah.
As if you have the perfect S, that is the perfect sensation of pain, is somewhere in the Platonic world. You don't really have the pain, but it's somebody else in the heavens who has the pain.
Yeah. Yeah, this is most definitely things that have been haunting the Occidental Western civilization for millennia.
But there was something useful in what Kenny said. He said that there are actually two meanings. He makes a difference between knowing the meaning of a word and applying the word.
Oh yeah, I like that too.
Because it's you, Hans, who have pointed out it several times with the Spanish example, caña.
Yes.
But still, it doesn't really resolve the problem, because this is the caña example is a public word.
It is a public word, definitely. Yes.
So Kenny's problem, he doesn't resolve the problem, unfortunately.
No, it doesn't seem that way. Yeah. See what you mean.
But let's perhaps enter Hans.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, why not? It's still introductory, and we have the end line here at all. And happy to say also Canfield will enter here. Canfield, we read, I think, 2 articles from. So there will be recognizable names here. And McGinn will turn up again. Stroud. So it's a very good way where we get other people and then how they interpret it. And then we have these minuscule corrections or miniature subtleties that come out. That wouldn't be possible for the subtleties to come out if people before have written about Wittgenstein. This is one of the charms with what Lynn's doing. Seems interesting.
Yes,
I say thank you very much, Kalle Lundahl.
Thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for joining in. Have a very pleasant morning, afternoon, day, or evening, wherever you are. Do enjoy and be happy that private language is on the demise. I end the recording here.